Yeah, so I'm Mona Sobhani. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and I'm going to tell the story of how I went from being a strictly scientific materialist neuroscientist to being a more open-minded spiritual seeker. And it was a combination of personal and scientific proof that helped me along the way. So I'm going to talk about all of those things today. So I'm just going to start with my story. So I started off as a cognitive neuroscientist, traditionally trained. I got my Ph.D. at the University of Southern California in cognitive neuroscience. I focused on functional and structural neuroimaging. So when you think of research about the brain and you think of those MRI pictures, that's what I did. And I was always just curious about how things worked in the world, why they work the way that they do, and why people specifically behave the way that they do. And that's how I ended up studying neuroscience. And by the time I finished graduate school, I call it fully indoctrinated into the, Western worldview, the scientific materialist paradigm. And I'm going to talk about why that is, how they train us. And so by the time I finished grad school, I was fully on that. But in the background of my personal life, my cultural heritage is that I'm Persian. My parents are originally from Iran. And in our culture, much like in many other cultures around the world, there's a tradition of divination, which is using various methods. It could be tarot cards, but in the instance of my family, it was my mother and my grandmother would use coffee grounds from Armenian coffee to divine the future, or just things that are going on in your life at the time. Even it doesn't even have to be future events. And this was always going on in the background of my family gatherings. I never paid attention to it. I didn't even know what it was. And then when I did learn what it was, I definitely didn't believe in it. But my friends, as I got older, my friends would argue over who could come over to get readings from my mom because she was allegedly so good. And the stories in our family go that our grandmother was exceptional. So that was kind of going on in the background, and I never paid too much attention to it. But I'm from Los Angeles, and my parents still lived in LA. So while I was going to grad school, I would go home every weekend, see my parents. So my mom would read my coffee for me. And so I let her, I let her start doing that. And then I noticed that some of the things that she said would come true. And so I started taking copious notes every time she would read for me. And I thought, it's just kind of casual and fun. We'll just see. I'll just take notes. We'll see what happens. And over the years, I realized that she was more right than she was wrong. And she was very detailed on the things that she could pick up, like very small nuances of like subtle dynamics within relationships or small details about a situation. Like there's no way she would have been able to guess these things. And she wasn't trying to guess, she had no interest in proving to anyone that she could do it or not. It was just something she did for people. Oh, you want me to read your cup? I'll tell you the images I see. And it was through this that I didn't know how it worked. I just knew it worked. And I just lived in cognitive dissonance where I kept this separate from my scientific training and from the rest of my life. And I didn't try to figure it out or think about it really. And then I think after I graduated grad school, I hit the workforce, but I didn't have a lot of purpose. And I think when you're working towards a goal like your PhD, you're very just laser focused. You want to get through it. You feel like you have great purpose because it's this big, important thing in your life. Once you've accomplished that, and then you kind of hit the job market and you're showing up to your job every day and not loving what you do, I think I became a little disenchanted, and I was looking to these coffee readings to like tell me about something exciting coming down the pipeline for my future. So there were two events that really shook my foundation that caused this whole project. And eventually I wrote a book on everything that I experienced and discovered. And so one of them was in 2016, my mother, 5 weeks in advance of this event, saw something in the coffee. And normally she doesn't, wouldn't give really like dire predictions. But this time she kind of told me like, oh, I feel like I have to warn you because it keeps showing up. And at this point, it's just come up so many times that I just feel like I need to tell you that you're going to get some very bad news. And she wouldn't tell me what it was. She didn't want to make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. She just said, the only thing I'm going to say is it's bad news and that you should be prepared. And that luckily it's not super close to you in your life, but it's something in your periphery. And so 5 weeks later, one of my professors that I got help on one of my dissertation experiments with, he was killed by one of the students in our graduate school program. And it was obviously a very devastating event that happened. So when I told my mom, she's like, that's what I saw. I saw a death. She's like, but I didn't want to, say it out loud. And so she had seen this for like 5-6 weeks in advance. And I could not get over that. I could not get over what does that mean? Was it his fate? Was it his destiny? How could that be written in the ether? How could she sense that? And I had a really hard time with it. It kind of scared me. It shook me. And then I just continued living my life. And then 2 years later, something similar happened. She had seen this relationship coming into my life, and it seemed like it was all going to be positive. But there was a point where it was not good. I thought it was a disaster. And so I remember thinking, oh, she's wrong this time. But so then what does that mean? But she was right on all the details, but she was wrong on the outcome. And I thought, okay, this is interesting now, because she's still getting a lot of information that there's no way that she could know, but why is she wrong? So is there a thing as fate or destiny, or do things change? Like, how does this work? So I also since I mentioned I was kind of not in a great place, and I had seen this relationship as, I kind of put all my hopes in it, like it's going to save me, it's going to make me happy finally. And of course, that's never the case. It never works. And so when that didn't work out the way that I wanted it to, it was kind of like I think of it as like that was my life raft, and then the life raft popped, and then I was just lost at sea. And so my foundation was pulled out from under me. It was just a disaster. And at first, I didn't do anything about it. But as I kind of came out of that dark place, I started to think about the coffee, and I started to wonder, how did it work? And it just kind of started consuming my mind. How is it possible that my, mother, who I trust, who I know is not trying to trick me, who I know what she knows and doesn't know, about situations in my life, how is it that she can pick up these really incredibly this detailed information from seemingly out of nowhere, and then specifically things about the future, that didn't align with my training and my understanding of the scientific paradigm and of our reality. And so it was like an uncomfortable place that I found myself in, and I needed to have answers. So some of my friends were like, oh, we know a few psychics, if you want to go try that out. And at first I was like, oh, I don't need to go to a psychic. They're frauds. That's not real. But then they pointed out that I was getting readings from my mom anyway. And what's the difference? And they knew that these women in particular were very good, because they would turn you away if they couldn't read your energy, which is the language that they use themselves. And so my friends and I kind of did this a very casual 1 year kind of pseudo experiment, just all of us together, where we would go to one psychic, all of us, and then we'd go to different psychics at the same time, and then the same psychic over different times. And we kind of just did this for fun to see, like, are they guessing? If we switched readings, would we be able to apply, each other's readings to our own lives? And we recorded the readings, we took notes and all that. And by the end, we were like, not everything they say comes true and is accurate, but they tell you that themselves. They say, everything I say is true for this moment, but there's a lot of variables and things change all the time. But the things that they would get right, they would be right on a lot of variables, like 5 variables, 6 variables, 7 variables, to the point, and they weren't vague things. They were all very specific things from each of our lives that didn't apply to each other if we switched the readings. And so that intrigued me even more. And I thought, okay, so maybe there's something really here. And that's when I launched this kind of personal project. And it was really just so that I could have answers to the universe, but to understanding how that universe worked. But it turned into a bigger thing. And so I started with the intuitives, the psychics, because I wanted to understand, how do they perceive this information? How does it feel for them? As a neuroscientist, I was interested in that. Like, how does it come in and how do you work with it? And then when I started realizing that I was not believing, but I was curious about this, I started feeling that push against my identity as a scientist, and started to wonder what other scientists believed in, and if they believed in spirituality or if they believed in anything quote unquote paranormal. And so I started interviewing my scientist colleagues because I just wanted to know I wasn't crazy or, what did they think? I had no idea what any of them believed in. So I interviewed scientists, the intuitives, and then I branched out to other mystics, some other behavioral health practitioners. And eventually I found there was the Windbridge Research Institute was doing research on psychic mediums, and they so I reached out to them. They gave me a huge reading list, telling me, oh, this psychic phenomenon has been studied for like over 100 years by so many different labs. There's a lot of evidence, it's just not very well known by mainstream science. So they gave me a huge reading list. I dug into that and then just kept reaching out to people doing the research, involved in the field, and just tried to keep really an open, curious mind to all of it. But I had a crisis because they were right. There was a lot of evidence, and I went and found scientific papers. I spoke to these people directly. They seemed honest, and like all their methods were reasonable. And I just started to come up. I had this identity crisis of like, I'm a scientist. I can't believe in any of this stuff. This is like ridiculous, But then I'd be like, but we followed the evidence, and so I had this entire back and forth for a very long time, and that's the divination piece of it. And the other thing I want to say before I move on is that during the readings, the psychics or the intuitives would mention things about karma, like, oh, this was a karmic relationship. You had a past life with this person. We incarnate for soul lessons. They would talk about all these things. And I didn't know what any of that meant. I didn't believe in any of it. So I just listened. I wrote it down. And then I was listening to a totally different type of podcast. Chelsea Handler had a limited series podcast on her latest book. And randomly, one of her episodes had Laura Lynn Jackson on, who's a psychic medium. And she started describing this spiritual framework. And it was the same one I had heard in the readings. And so it kind of caught my attention, like, oh, this is the second time I'm hearing this, and I've never heard of this before. So I listened, and then they mentioned a book. They didn't discuss what the book was about. It was called Many Lives, Many Masters by Brian Weiss. They just said it was a psychiatrist case study, and it was really interesting, and everyone should read the book. So I ordered it, not knowing what it was about, just curious. And then when I read the book, and that happened around the same time that I was finishing, my friends and I were finishing up getting the readings. And so I read the book and I thought, well, this is interesting and weird. And I didn't know what to think of it, because it was a well-credentialed, well-trained psychiatrist from prestigious universities who was writing this book about past life regression, like patients undergoing hypnotic regression and describing past lives. But in the book, it was the same framework as that I had heard from the psychics, and then also from Laura Lynn Jackson. And it was just curious to me that, that this kept coming up. And so I thought, let me just dig into this. I'm interested. So as somebody who's interested in mental health and understanding the brain, I just thought it was strange that if you put someone under regression and asked them to describe a spiritual framework, that's the one that they would describe. When the research, when I dug into it, showed that they didn't, the people didn't necessarily believe in reincarnation. They wouldn't even be familiar with it. They oftentimes wouldn't remember recounting it in the session. It was just kind of a strange phenomenon that I was curious about. So that's where the story starts. And one thing I keep asking myself is, why did I end up in crisis over all of this? But the reason is because that our paradigm tells us, our mainstream paradigm, scientific materialism, tells us that believing in impossible things, which are things that don't align with materialism, physicalism, mechanism, that's crazy, that you're crazy, delusional, it's magical thinking, you're stupid. But you also can't ignore evidence, especially scientific evidence, says the paradigm. If there's evidence, you have to follow the evidence. And we see that in our society with all this evidence-based language, data-driven information. You see a very large emphasis on that now, trying to avoid the mistakes of the past where we didn't do that. But when I dug in, there actually was scientific evidence for some of these impossible things. But then I would come right back to, but believing in impossible things makes you crazy. And so it was just this like back and forth loop that went on for months, maybe a year, of this kind of identity crisis and just crisis in general of like, these things happen, I've experienced them, there's even some evidence for it, but you can't talk about it in public and people will think you're crazy. So, and the reason for that, of course, is just our paradigm, and it comes from the time of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment as kind of like a backlash against religion, hardcore religion. And as I mentioned, its current form is just materialism, physicalism, mechanism. So one of the broader principles being the universe is not alive. It's dead, it's random and meaningless, and any meaning that we find in it is created by humans. And I'm going to talk about that more from the neuroscience perspective in a minute, but we have confused technological advancement because we have been able to greatly advance technology and leverage it and use it to improve conditions for humanity, but we've confused that with this scientific materialist paradigm, and that's where we find ourselves. But many scientists do believe in a higher power and in exceptional human experiences. So I didn't know this when I started the project, but as I did research, I found this to be true, that I actually thought it would be maybe 20%, if that, of scientists believed in a higher power, but the latest survey showed actually 51% of scientists actually believe in some kind of power, higher power. So it could be like a universal higher power, it could be God, it varies, but they believe in something. And when the National Academy of Sciences actually did a survey with scientists asking if they believed in extrasensory perception or kind of paranormal phenomena, and only 4% of them said they believed in it, but 10% of them said they believed it should be investigated nonetheless. But there was another study more recently that anonymously surveyed 175 scientists and engineers, and 93.2% of them said they had at least one type of experience that we consider an exceptional human experience, which is like felt another person's emotions, had known something to be true that they would have no way of knowing, received important information through dreams, or seen in colors or energy fields around people, places, or things. So when they're not being asked by their, one of their professional societies, when it's anonymously, people are much more willing to tell you the truth. And I found that to be true also when I launched my project and started talking to scientists. All the conversations were held in confidence. I promised never to say anything unless they, agreed to let me use their names, but they were very forthcoming in private, but when it comes to taking it public, it's a different story. But it's common these experiences are not exceptional. They're actually very typical. They're typical human experiences and have been experienced by the majority of humanity for the majority that humankind has existed on Earth. And it's only in this current time frame, this current, slice that we find ourselves in, that it's not acceptable, and it's kind of, I don't want to say suppressed, but it's just ignored or dismissed. So this brings me to neuroscience. And neuroscientists are they're even more skeptical than regular scientists, because in addition to that paradigm I've been talking about, neuroscience has its own ways to explain, neuroscience and psychology has its own ways to explain why humans are mistaken for thinking they've, felt something impossible. So these are some of the core principles we learn in neuroscience. All learning for humans comes through the brain. So it comes through your sensors and through the brain. If you were born but placed in a box and nothing ever happened, you would never learn anything. And your brain is a coincidence detector, which is true. It searches for patterns, and then it creates meaning from those patterns based on what it knows. And then it tells a story about it. So it's also a storyteller. And I'm going to talk about these. So there's two hemispheres to the brain. They're connected by a bundle of neurons called the corpus callosum. And back in the day, they used to sever this bundle of neurons for some patients, like if they had intractable epilepsy. And then you would end up with these patients that have two hemispheres that can't speak to each other. And it would cure the intractable epilepsy, but then it would cause a host of other problems. And it helped us learn about the two different hemispheres and how they're very different from each other. They have their own personalities, they have their own preferences. And while they share a lot of, they both do motor, they both do sensory, perception, and action, they also have specific things that each of them do better than the other. And so I'm going to talk about this experiment, the split brain patient, that shows how your brain is a storyteller. So our left hemisphere contains what we call the left hemisphere interpreter. And it also contains, for most people, language, where language is produced and understood. And so in these patients, since their brain, the two hemispheres can't speak to each other, what the researchers did was present a stimulus to either the right eye, which would go to the left hemisphere, or to the left eye, which would go to the right hemisphere, and then do different kinds of tests to see, to parse the functions. So if they showed, let's say, the word face to the right eye, which goes to the left hemisphere, and then they asked the participant, what did you read? Since language is in the left hemisphere, they're able to say back to the researcher, I read face, or I saw a face. But if you did the same thing, if you showed a face, let's say, or the word face to the left eye and it went to the right hemisphere, and then you asked the participant, what did you see? They wouldn't be able to tell you, because language is in the left hemisphere and the information for what they saw is in the right, and the two hemispheres can't speak to each other. And so they would say, they wouldn't be able to answer. But if you asked them to draw it, they would draw something. They would draw a face or a cup of water or whatever it was that they saw. And then when the experimenter asks them, why did you draw that? Let's say it was a cup of water. Their brain starts to create a story, because it doesn't actually know why. The left hemisphere doesn't have the information of what the right hemisphere saw, but it says, oh, I've drawn a cup of water, I must be thirsty. It reasons out why I would have done that. Oh, I drew a face. It's probably because I saw your face. I was thinking of faces, so I drew a face. The correct answer would be, I don't know why I drew a cup of water or a face, but the brain doesn't like not having answers. So it usually just creates one, just however it can. And that's what these really interesting experiments have taught us about the brain, which is also why people can't be trusted to really know what they're saying matches actually what's going on within. And the brain is also a coincidence detector. As I mentioned, it is fine-tuned to find patterns in our environment. This is just a silly example, but it's like believing that you see faces everywhere you look. Like, there aren't actually faces in these things, but you view it as a face because humans have evolutionarily developed to recognize faces. And so there's various names for these different kinds of phenomena. And this is also another example. The brain filters information. So there's a lot of information coming in at once. It cannot, deal with all of it. So its whole goal in life is to kind of decide, all right, what information do I want to pay attention to that has served me in the past, that is going to serve me best going in the future, type of thing. Usually you ask people to count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball back and forth to each other. And people are so focused on this task, right? They have their goal, like, I need to count, that they miss that in the middle of the video, there's this man in a gorilla suit walking through. So in this experiment, when they asked participants, how many times did they pass the ball, they would tell them. And then when they asked, did you notice anything else weird about the video? A lot of people didn't notice at all because they were so focused. And so that's one way your brain filters out information that's irrelevant to the current goal. It also filters out based on our fears, our pasts, and our personalities. So for example, if you have a fear of an animal, so I'm afraid of sharks. So I'm more fine-tuned to news stories about shark attacks than I am about spider bites or snake bites or something else, right? So my filter in my brain looks for those stories because that's one of my fears. It's also based on personalities. If you tend to have more of a kind of anxious personality type, you might scan more for threatening things in your environment. And then a more positive example is if something has been rewarding to you in the past, like every time you have bought a pink stone, you've like gotten a big sum of money afterward or something. If you associate money, like some kind of reward, with a stimulus, then you're more likely to scan your environment, or your brain is like more likely to develop a filter for that. And so all of these things create who we are. But one more thing is it uses beliefs to filter information. So if you believe that Prius drivers are the worst drivers and they make the most egregious driving errors on the road, then you are more likely to notice when a Prius does that, has that behavior, and more likely to remember. And so confirmation bias is what that's called, and a few others. So these are just examples of how your brain has a lot of filters. There's a lot of information coming in. It can't deal with all of it. So it has to kind of nip and tuck things that it doesn't need, keep the things that have been important to it. Like, I'm scared of this. I need to remember this. This has been rewarding to me. I need to pay attention to this. But takeaway from getting a PhD in neuroscience is that the brain cannot be trusted. And so it turns into this machine that, based on all your past experiences, it operates kind of mechanistically on its own, but you cannot trust it. You can't believe it. And that's how impossible experiences are explained away with psychology. You didn't perceive it, you're remembering it wrong. You wanted to believe that, so that's why you perceived it that way. You forgot all the other times, something similar happened. That's how they're explained away with psychology. And then in neuroscience, we take it one step further by trying to explain the neural correlates, meaning where precisely in the brain you can point to say, this is where that experience that you think you had originates from, and kind of explain it away like that, like, oh, it was just activation of this area. And as you can imagine, not a lot of research funding has been put into examining the neural correlates of impossible experiences. There have been some studies looking at like psychic phenomena, but the thing with brain imaging research is that it's very noisy, meaning you need a lot of research to make any sense of the data. And so there's not a lot of reliable, good studies on that. So the closest thing that I thought would be interesting was there has been some research on spiritual and mystical experiences, and where the neural correlates of that are in the brain. And so I'm going to read a quote from a participant in a psychedelic research trial, and this is how they described their mystical or spiritual experience that they had on a psychedelic, a high-dose psychedelic. But this is pretty common. It's a similar thing that a lot of people describe. So I bowed to this force. It was more about reverence. I was showing my respect. I was humbled and honored to be in this presence. It felt more real than any reality I have experienced. And it was a familiar place too, one I had felt before. It was when I surrendered to this that I felt like I let go. I was gone. I was in the void. This void had a strange and indescribable quality to it, this feeling of unconditional and undying love. It felt like my soul was basking in the feeling of this space. Time and space did not exist there. And so, in looking at the research on mystical and spiritual experiences, there's a scale that's been created to measure whether you've had one of these experiences, and these are the metrics that they kind of the qualities that they measure. So one is a sense of sacredness, so a sense that what you've encountered is holy or sacred. These are the words that people commonly use when they come back from an experience like this. They say there's a noetic quality, meaning it's imbued with an aspect of meaning and a sense of encountering ultimate reality that is more real than usual everyday reality. Come back saying this is one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. I felt like that was reality, and now I'm back in this not reality. There's also deeply felt positive mood, so feelings of joy, ecstasy, peace, ineffability, meaning it's very difficult to put into words what you've experienced. Paradoxicality, so to explain the experience, it seems that you have to describe the coexistence of mutually exclusive states or concepts, so such as I was everything and I was nothing. The transcendence of time and space, so traditional notions of time and space have no meaning. So these are all very commonly reported in mystical and spiritual experiences. And so looking at the neuroscience literature on this topic, there's some work that we have that looks at patients who have a damage to certain areas of the brain. That's one research method we have. Okay, when a part of the brain is damaged, what behavior is knocked out or changed? And then we also can do something similar, but not as obviously extreme or drastic as a lesion. We can, with neurostimulation, so with magnetic or electric stimulation, we can kind of knock out a brain area for a while to see the effects. So change the activity and see what happens. And so using these techniques, there's some evidence in the literature that some aspects of spiritual and mystical experiences can be pinpointed to certain regions in the brain. On this slide, it's the temporoparietal junction, which is very fancy, but it's basically just on the figure of the brain, it's where that circle is. So it's where the temporal and the parietal cortices come together. But it's essentially an area where it pulls together a lot of different functions. It kind of helps you understand where you are in space and time, how your sense of self relates to your body, relates to your environment. And so when you have a lesion or neurostimulate it in some way, you can have some of the aspects, you can suddenly feel like you're spiritually aware, whatever that means, that you've connected to the transcendent, that you saw God, that you saw people who have passed away. You might feel like you've left your body and have an out-of-body experience where you feel like your consciousness left and you can look back or look down on your own body. So not every aspect that I mentioned on the previous slide of mystical and spiritual experiences happens in this one region, but you'll hear it oftentimes used as a way to dismiss or explain spiritual mystical experiences. Oh, it's there was some sort of activity, or it's just the temporoparietal junction. So that's one way that's done. And so meditation, there's been a lot of research on this in the past 2 decades. People commonly report having spiritual and mystical experiences in deep states of meditation. So in that literature, they've been able to identify this one brain network called the default mode network. This is the hot topic these days. So the default mode network is believed to be your kind of core sense of self, your identity. And when you're not doing something, when you're not engaged in a task and you're just sitting, and usually when you're just sitting, you're thinking about what you were doing yesterday, what you're going to do tomorrow, what you're going to do the rest of the night. Your mind wandering and you're thinking about yourself usually. That's when the default mode network is on, and it's kind of your default. That's why it's named that way. But then when you move to do a task, the activity is reduced. And so they found that in meditation, the default mode network's activity is also reduced. It's kind of your sense of self. And so it was hypothesized that because in meditation you kind of enter this relaxed state and the default mode network reduces its function, that's why you see this kind of quieting of the mind. The focus on the self is reduced. The boundary between self and other is reduced. And sometimes you'll hear people say, I merged with my environment. I was one with everything. It's believed that that's because of the dampening of the default mode network, which is reducing your sense of self and reducing your sense of separateness. One of the brain regions involved in this network also is related to sensing time and space. And so with reduction in its activity, it's also hypothesized that's why you feel timelessness and spacelessness in these kinds of states. So psychedelics is another. Psychedelics are a class of psychoactive substances. They can elicit intense sensory and consciousness altering experiences. And this is a new line of research that's really surged in the last decade, I would say, decade. And so common psychedelics are psilocybin, ayahuasca, mescaline, lysergic acid, better known as LSD, and dimethyltryptamine, better known as DMT. So from this literature, many people who've taken psychedelic drugs, they've reported having spiritual or mystical experiences. It's almost like you can reliably get a spiritual or mystical experience on a very high dose psychedelic. So there's been a recent, surge in research looking at this, even though over millennia, many indigenous peoples on every continent have used psychedelics for various purposes, many of them spiritual. And so looking at the psychedelic research, the neuroimaging work, we see the same thing. You see the default mode network basically disintegrate, which is not what people thought we would see. Neuroscientists thought because psychedelics, there's so much stimulation that you might see a huge increase in brain activity everywhere. But it turns out that that's not true. And one of the surprising findings was the disintegration of the default mode network, which really reduces your sense of yourself, all those things I talked about before. Your ego dissolves, there's no boundary between you and others, your self disappears, and you're not able, since there's no you, to time travel, think about the past or think about the future. This doesn't explain everything that psychedelics do, but this is the strongest one for spiritual mystical experiences. So taking all of that evidence together, when it comes to spiritual things or impossible things, the paradigm says everything is matter and physical, and meaning is created in the brain. The brain cannot be trusted. It's just a matter of neural activation. Give it enough time, we'll be able to map out where in the brain and what activity is happening. And that's why you're experiencing what you think you're experiencing. So these experiences, which are sometimes spiritual, are deemed impossible things, and they're dismissed and explained away. But as someone who has studied neuroscience, I can tell you that none of these neural correlates explain why anybody would have these experiences. Like, all it does is explain how these occur through physiology. So me telling you the amygdala lights up or the default mode network disintegrates, it doesn't explain why that would be the case when you take a psychedelic, and why the subsequent, for argument's sake, if you were to have asked a neuroscientist to hypothesize what would happen if the default mode network disintegrates, you might say boundary of self and other is disintegrated. But some of the other things that happen on psychedelics, like for example on DMT, people often report being taken to another reality. Your like current everyday consciousness reality disappears, and you're in a new space where you're seeing geometric shapes, sometimes encountering entities that people describe as angels, elves, fairies, gnomes. And those kinds of things, and a lot of others from the reports of psychedelics in particular, there's no obvious reason why we would see a fairy or an elf or describe any kind of mythological creature that our current day society does not believe in, and why you would see geometric shapes. I mean, so none of it really explains why it's happening, because we could have easily evolved to see something else, but we didn't. And so the question still remains, why is the mystical experience described as having encountered something sacred? The words that are chosen are very purposeful, and we see it chosen across different cultures, across different studies, across time. So it's just a very interesting phenomenon, and explaining it with neurocorrelates doesn't explain it really. So, but without ever breaching spirituality, there are already holes in the neuroscientific paradigm. We already have anomalies that we can't explain. So one, for example, is savants. Savants are people who are born with skill sets and knowledge that they could not have possibly reasonably acquired through their five senses. So as I mentioned earlier, we in the neuroscience paradigm believe that you learn everything through your five senses. But for example, that there was like a famous movie back in the day called Rain Man of a savant. So he was a real person, Kim Peek, and he, despite having poor motor skills and developmental disabilities, he could read 2 pages at once, one with the left eye, one with the right eye, in 3 seconds. He remembered every piece of music he ever heard, and he memorized over 12,000 books. So these people are really exceptional in their capabilities, and their capabilities are far above and beyond what we would expect from normal neurological function. We can't explain them with the current paradigm. They're supposed to not be able to know how to do a lot of these things or have a lot of this knowledge without, actively trying to acquire it. But that is the mystery and the anomaly, because they do and they can. Another sort of interesting thing is sometimes when there's a not common, they're rare cases, but when a certain brain injury, and it could be any region of the brain, sometimes when there's an injury, new skills emerge in the person. And again, we have no way to just explain these, because it's like someone is in a car accident, a certain part of their brain is injured, and then as they recover, you'll see new skills emerge, like suddenly they have photographic memory, suddenly they're musical genius, like on an instrument they've never learned how to play in their entire life. They come back with mathematical mastery. And my favorite is some of them even come back with expertise in a foreign language, not just a few words, like actual expertise in a foreign language that they have never learned before, all from after having a brain injury. So according to our current paradigm, that should just not be possible, because they haven't been trying to take in that information. There's no way their brain should be able to learn that. Some people try to explain it by saying maybe our brains have latent capabilities, like in our genetic memory. Maybe when there's an injury, it somehow releases that, but there's no evidence for that. And it doesn't align with the main model that we have. And this is just another example. The 2 pictures on the right are a normal brain scan, and the 2 on the left are from this healthy young man who had a university degree in math, and he had an IQ of 126, but he had a severe case of hydrocephalus, so cerebrospinal fluid was filling the majority of his skull. And the brain is actually just that small white speck, and it was only about 2 millimeters thick. So there's this like totally normally functioning human. And normally we would say he needs a motor cortex, a sensory cortex, a visual cortex, hippocampus for memory, amygdala for fear and emotion. And none of that's there. And he's still, so there's all these exceptional cases in neuroscience, anomalies that we just ignore, but that poke holes in the model. It's not a complete model to begin with. And just to reiterate what the paradigm says, impossible phenomena, they're kind of explained as subjective misperceptions, like you misperceived it, your brain made up a story about it. And evolutionary meaning making, meaning there was some evolutionary advantage for us having evolved this way, that our, in the way that our brains create stories, find meaning, find patterns, believe in a higher power. It must have been advantageous to us in some way, which may be true. But again, it doesn't really explain it. The other thing is, what happens when the perception is veridical or true, which is what I experienced and many other people have experienced. It's true that we create meaning, but that's the internal subjective perception and experience. But when you can match it and map it onto truth, like if it's an event that comes true exactly as predicted, then what? And so I already mentioned a few of my own personal divination experiences, but there's actually countless examples of these throughout human history, but in the literature, people waking up in the middle of the night, it's like 3:03 a.m. They look over, they see their husband who's been away at war at the foot of the bed. The husband turns around, looks like there's a shotgun blast to the back of the head or something. And then the next day, the person finds out their husband was killed on the battlefield at 3:03 a.m. This is just an example that I read somewhere. But there are countless examples like that. And there's also many examples from the psychedelic literature. The psychotherapy and psychedelic literature from the 50s to 70s has countless examples of telepathy and precognitive visions that have come true. And so those are more, kind of, it's not a controlled experiment, but those are more controlled kind of client therapeutic settings where good notes have been taken. And so that's kind of where I got interested in this too, is like, what happens when you have this personal subjective experience, but if you come up against that, whatever it was is true, then where does that leave us? And anecdotes, a lot of times these are dismissed as just anecdotes, but anecdotes are case studies, and in large quantities, they're difficult to dismiss. And there's a lot in the literature. So for me, from my personal story, I was interested in, I got into all of this, like, I think of it as like a doorway with divination, with psychic phenomena. And then through that experience with some of the readings I got, and through Chelsea Handler's podcast and Brian Weiss's book, I got introduced to these kind of more Eastern philosophical, but ideas of spirituality, which I had never been exposed to, had never thought about before. And as I started looking into the literature, I wanted to know initially, just is psychic phenomena real? And I thanks to the Windbridge Research Center and that big reading list that they gave me, I found that it had been conducted for over a century by hundreds of scientists and hundreds of thousands of participants from a lot of good, prestigious institutions like Princeton, Duke, UC Berkeley, UCLA, and then there was substantial evidence. And a lot of times their studies were even better than our studies because they're just so scrutinized. And I found this review, there was actually a review. There had been so many studies done that there were a lot of what we call meta-analyses in science, which is you pull together all the studies and do stats to see if there's actually an effect or not. So there had been so many meta-analyses done that in 2018, someone was able to write a review on those and kind of look at the field and say, okay, is there any evidence for this statistically, scientifically? And they found that there was. And then before I hit the scientific research, actually, I had heard the story about the US government funding research for 25 plus years into psychic phenomena at the Stanford Research Institute. And I spoke to them, I read their papers, I read their books, I looked at this, but I know a lot of people don't trust the government or think there's a lot of misinformation from the government. But in my personal story, I thought that this work was really telling just because I have applied for government funding myself and I've gotten it, and I know how hard it is to get it in the first place, but to get it renewed for 25 years for multiple different agencies, unless it's complete misinformation, seems unlikely to be true if there was no effect or no demonstrable benefit. The group was funded by NASA, the CIA, Defense Intelligence, the Army, all these different arms of the government. And it was actually so good that they turned it into a training program where they trained Army officers to be able to do it. They called it remote viewing, but it's psychic phenomena, basically. And they were able to predict a lot of things operationally for the US government, like locate a Soviet weapons factory. I guess they predicted a failed Chinese atomic bomb test 3 days in advance. They helped the Berkeley police identify the kidnapper of heiress Patricia Hearst, and even President Jimmy Carter admitted that they used the program to find coordinates to locate a missing plane. And all of the work was reviewed by the former president of the American Statistical Association and a UC Irvine professor. And she said, using the standard applied to any other area of science, she concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. So I thought that was pretty telling, but I know some people don't care for government programs, which is why I dug into the normal scientific literature also and read the review and the meta-analyses. But no matter how you cut it, there's a lot of evidence. So it's either that our statistics and the way we analyze studies is wrong, or there is some sort of phenomenon going on. And so I'm just going to touch on, I'm not going to talk about these too in depth, but because my kind of entry point into the more spiritual literature was Many Lives, Many Masters, and kind of that whole idea of past lives and karma, I looked into past life regression. And for me, it was really just, okay, so if you put someone in a very relaxed state, a kind of a hypnotized state, and you ask them to describe a spiritual framework, it seemed that a lot of the practitioners, they all found common descriptions of this framework, irregardless of whether that was what the person believed in or whether they came from a culture that believed in that. So I thought that was really strange. And what was even stranger was that it actually seemed to work. And so I was really blown away by, and I really dug into a lot of the studies and a lot of the books, looking at it. It seems ridiculous. I mean, it seems like patients are making up stories if past lives weren't true. Like, oh, they're making up a fantasy, but then it heals them when other methods haven't. And so I did find some current studies looking at this, that it does heal emotional, social, and physical problems, but it also it alleviates fear of death. It just elicits a more positive and meaningful perspective about life. So it seemed to be very positive for the patients and very actually healing. And then it's not a great tool or for scientific inquiry. It's not a rigorous method to figure out if past lives are accurate or not. But as I was looking, I just kind of took note. It did seem like it didn't matter if the patients believed in or had positive attitudes toward reincarnation. That didn't predict whether they would remember a past life or not. Occasionally, substantial historically accurate information could be obtained and then verified. And Dr. Helen Wambach, her work did a lot of that. She had group regressions and she would take notes and fact check historically a lot of the things that the patients would say and kind of try to figure out if there's if they're making it up, there's got to be a lot of discrepancies. And she didn't find many discrepancies between what they described for specific time periods and what was historically accurate. Sometimes also similar to when someone has a damage to a certain brain area and can spontaneously speak a foreign language. In past life regressions, sometimes you see a similar thing where language skills that they shouldn't normally have, they're able to display those during the regression, which is a very just strange phenomena. There's also been cases where two people have described the exact same past life without knowing that the other person was involved or that they had described that life. And so some of the people the practitioners whose work I was reading, they also kind of stumbled upon it. This was in the 70s and 80s, and they weren't looking to do it. They didn't believe in it necessarily. They just stumbled upon it, became curious, started engaging with it, took notes, and then, had enough information that was conciliatory over a lot of patients that they were able to write summaries of what they believed these patients were delivering as a spiritual framework. So it's not that it's necessarily true or not. And anyway, in my journey, I've come to redefine what true or reality means. But it is very interesting that this is a phenomena that if somebody goes into this hypnotic state, that this is a framework that they report. It's a pretty interesting phenomena, even if it's just something coded in our genetic memory or however we want to explain it away. And this, of course, made me curious about reincarnation in general, which led me to the work from the University of Virginia, where they look at children who, between the ages of 2 to 5, they'll start, emotionally speaking about a past life, and they can include very specific details about that life that the researchers can then go look up and validate and correlate with the previous past life that they described. And in many of the cases, identities can be, I think it's at 68% of their spontaneous reincarnation cases, they've been able to tie it to a previous personality. They've also been using birth defects and deformities. So sometimes birthmarks or birth defects correspond to wounds, typically fatal, that were suffered by the previous personality, but 35% of those cases, they could identify the previous personality and tie it back. So very interesting research. And near-death experiences are also kind of in this category where there's a similar spiritual framework sometimes described by participants. So near-death experiences is like a lucid experience associated with your, perceiving that your consciousness again separates and is apart from your body. And it's usually during a time of actual or threatened imminent death. So like during cardiac arrest. And there's a lot of different elements of the NDE. I won't go through all of them, but like seeing a bright light, going through a tunnel, having an out-of-body experience, sometimes having a life review. And one interesting one that's kind of similar to something sometimes reported on psychedelics is having a more clearly and rapidly functioning mind. And these are usually dismissed by normal scientific materialists as, oh, it's residual brain activity, it's abnormal concentrations of blood gas levels. But there's actually been a lot of studies showing there were no differences between cardiac arrest patients, those who had NDEs and those who didn't. So no difference in blood gas levels. And also in the brain flatlines, the experiences that they're reporting are so vivid and intense and detailed, it doesn't map onto the brain having no activity, which is kind of a common dismissive way to explain, oh, there must have been some activity, but there wasn't enough activity to explain what the person is saying they experienced, which is usually very intense, very vivid. There's also been some look of like, if you believe in NDEs or familiar with them, or you're more likely to have one. That turned out to not be true. And the NDEs occur under different circumstances that don't involve oxygen deprivation. So that like constellation of symptoms around an NDE can happen during someone having an existential crisis, a severe depression, during meditation and isolation. So it's a wide variety of conditions. Oxygen doesn't really explain it. And similar thing that I mentioned about temporal lobe stimulation. So if you stimulate certain parts of the brain, the temporoparietal junction, the temporal lobe, you can get some elements of an NDE, similar to some elements of a spiritual and mystical experience, but it doesn't explain all of it. So all the features, and it wouldn't be considered an NDE if you used the checklist. So really, what's the big takeaway from all this for me? So I went on this crazy journey trying to find if there's any evidence, not only for psychic phenomena being an actual thing, but also there being any kind of spirituality to the universe, which I definitely did not believe in. And I found that the scientific materialist paradigm, Western worldview, it doesn't account for many typical human experiences that we've had, that I've had, but I found that many other worldviews do. And as I was digging into the philosophy and physics of all of this to see if it could possibly be true, I found that a lot of this is still being discussed. Our worldview is just one worldview, the Western worldview, but there's also, a lot of some physicists believe in panpsychism, a lot of philosophers, some physicists are saying space-time is doomed. Don Hoffman is a neuroscientist who says that he's been doing simulations on how we as humans could not have evolved to see reality as it is. That wasn't evolutionary beneficial for us. And so the point of this is just to say, I kind of probably like many scientists, we come into this with one worldview, thinking all of our scientific evidence supports this one worldview. Well, of course it does, because that's the only place we're looking. But if you broaden out to philosophy or spirituality, or physics, or other sciences and other fields, especially the humanities, where a lot of these kind of more impossible stories are held, then it starts to make more sense that there's just not a good weaving together of all of this. It's just the worldview is exclusionary. But I found in all this research that believing that we're interwoven with the cosmos and that there's no true distinction between mind and matter, outside and inside, you and me, it's actually been the foundation of reality longer than it hasn't, and in most cultures. And so I came to think of our worldviews as limited data sets. So like I had this data set in my mind, like an Excel sheet, and I had locked it. I didn't want any updates. I was a scientific materialist. I was a scientist. The world is physical, everything's matter, and I didn't update it. But through this entire experience, I just learned I shouldn't lock my worldview. I should embrace both objective scientific proof as well as personal proof, because at the end of the day, that's what it really took, I think, to convince me. And now I just try to stay radically curious, because I never thought I would be here trying to be open-minded. And so I don't know where I'll end up next. And while I try to stay open-minded, I still bring discernment, but I do think that we should accept these experiences as typical human experiences, kind of destigmatize them, normalize them, talk about them, and then engage and embrace the mystical, because it really has been a long part of humanity's history and has probably served us well for a lot of reasons that we may not know the answers to, but we don't have to know. We just have to know that it's part of our legacy and our heritage, and it serves us well. And also, as I was doing this literature search, I found that these altered states of consciousness, whether it's meditation or psychedelics or breathwork or sound healing, they actually really do heal us in a lot of different ways, like releasing emotions, psychological healing. So I really think that, I write a psychedelics newsletter now, and I try to promote altered states as much as I can, because I do think it's something our society should embrace as a whole.